We're going to move into communications from elected officials, boards, committees, staff, commission reports, correspondence, and announcements. And I see that State Senator Julian Cyr is here with us this evening, so I'd like to lead with him. He's going to give us a brief legislative update. Good to see you. Happy holidays.
Thank you so much, President.
Thanks for coming in.
Glad to be here. Good evening. Just came over from celebrating with the towns of Dennis and Yarmouth, who have a championship football team 2 times. I'm a Nauset alum. They seem to beat Nauset every year, even when we bring in coaching, NFL level coaching. But it's glad to be with them and glad to be here with you folks, and appreciate the time, especially so close to the holidays. I've really felt that made it my point to make sure I represent 20 towns. Barnstable is the largest town in the Cape and Islands district, but the district stretches from Provincetown to Mashpee, the 6 island towns on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and then also the town of Gosnold, which is actually the smallest town in the Commonwealth. And so many of the initiatives and bills and legislation that we take up in the legislature ends up coming to you folks for implementation and falls to the town to be implemented. I have an appreciation for that as someone prior to this role spent 6 years working for the Department of Public Health. The town manager was just talking about the Board of Health. You know, we have 351 boards of health across the Commonwealth. So that line of communication is really important. And also so many things that you folks want to do, given the structure of how our state and local governments are intertwined, really has to, in many cases, ends up flowing up to Beacon Hill. And so I think it's really important that, like my predecessors and like my counterparts, the 3 state reps who represent Barnstable, to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence. I think I've worked with many members of this board on various issues, but wanted to make sure my first year in office didn't end without coming before the board. So glad to give you a brief update of some of the legislative matters that we have, a preview of some of the things that are going to come, and then glad to answer any questions, comments, and most importantly, I think ideas that you'd like my office to work on and the Cape delegation to work on. You know, I've really been heartened in this first year in office and being able to work with this Cape delegation. This is a bipartisan delegation that really puts politics aside and works towards the benefit of our communities. And I think for me, in what's a pretty toxic environment at the national level, that's been really encouraging. I was just with Will Crocker and with Tim Whalen, who represent the town, as well as Randy Hunt. So there's several bills, home rule bills that we've been working on. Some of them we've gotten done already. Others we're hoping to get done for you. There's House Bill 3673, which is an act relative to sewer construction and private way maintenance and improvement fund in the town of Barnstable. This was passed in the House. It's before Senate Council. It will be passed. They're just, you know, dotting I's and crossing T's. House Bill 3706, an act amending the charter of the city known as the town of Barnstable. This was passed and was signed by the governor in October. House Bill 3881, an act relative to the use of certain land in the town of Barnstable within residential districts. This is something that I've been working with town council, Councilor Cullum and others, and Representative Crocker on revising the language a little bit to make sure that to give it a better shot of being heard in the legislature. That's still in committee, in the Municipalities Committee. House Bill 3971, an act relative to the Centerville-Osterville Marston's Mill Fire District. Really proud to have worked with Rep. Crocker to get this passed in early November. I think we got it passed one day before we basically needed some language for the COM Fire Department to be able to reorganize some of their debt. That was signed by the governor, and I think it's significant for them and their maintenance of their operations. And then House Bill 3679, an act renaming Muddy Pond in the city known as the town of Barnstable to be called Crocker Pond. No relation to, I think, members of this council, former members of the council, current state representatives, but proud to have gotten that done. That was signed by the governor in November. Not technically a home rule petition, but I think another really significant piece for local action has been the work that we were able to get done in getting extra state resources for the Cape Tech project. Sarah Peak and I led this effort, and the state we were able to put through a tweak in the funding formula for this project. So we're going to see an additional $5.1 million in state funds for this project. That's going to mean nearly $10 million in savings to property taxpayers over the life of this project. That's significant. So something I'm very much proud to have gotten done. So those are the sort of local home rule efforts that we had. A number of towns have been very interested in expansion of room occupancy to include short-term rentals like Airbnbs, VRBOs, rentals for a week, a month. We have a lot of those in all of our communities. Every one of our the communities I represent actually has, we have about almost 50% of all the second homes in the state are here on the Cape. There's good there's indicators that I think that this is going to get done this legislative session. I was hoping and hopeful that this would have been done by now. In the Senate, we've actually passed this expansion of room occupancy twice. But in the House, the Speaker has made noises or indications that he is committed to putting this through, and the Governor has also included, albeit a relatively watered-down version, included that in his budget for proposed budget for FY18. I expect we'll see a similar proposal again in the budget that he proposes in January. This is going to be major, significant boost in revenue for all the communities I represent. It's probably the biggest sort of expansion in state funds that we'll see in quite some time, so really eager to get that done. On other statewide related issues, the town manager was talking about the well projects, and we've been working with his office and our counterparts to nudge Fish and Game and other entities to make sure that they're taking these meetings, that we're really looking at this. And we were just corresponding earlier today, the Environment and Science Technology Program. I'll be sending a letter in support of that. I assume my other members in the delegation will as well. A few other things I just want to update you on, and then glad to take questions. As a delegation, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how are we going to harness state resources to assist our communities in the wastewater infrastructure that we need to have. We have about a $4 billion need across the region. Across Barnstable County, I think here in the town of Barnstable, it's upwards of $600 million, excuse me. And the prospect that this is a major infrastructure project that if you look at the 208 plan, $4 billion problem, there's a commitment that the state is going to chip in a quarter of this, so $1 billion. And so the question in the delegation really has been, how do we get nearly $1 billion from the state over a 30 or 40 year period? How do you do that? Going about sort of a direct appropriation in the budget is difficult for many reasons. It's also difficult because you have turnover in these seats, in these positions, and you need that continuity. So the delegation has been spending a lot of time working with business leaders, primarily the Cape Cod Chamber, to come up with how we're going to get the state's $1 billion to support wastewater infrastructure. And we're not there yet, but we're arriving at some solutions I think are going to be very promising, and if we're able to enact these, will be very significant for our communities. I proposed a Cape Cod Water Protection Trust. This is an entity that would be able to receive additional monies, that state monies, also federal infrastructure dollars, and then be dispersed across the towns. The original proposal that we filed, we've actually are working to amend pretty significantly, working with the Treasurer's Office to basically align the program very closely with the existing Clean Water Trust and the programs the Treasurer's Office and DEP implements. But I think increasingly the idea is that with expansion of room occupancy, that this may be the opportunity for us to come up with additional dollars to dedicate to part of the state's portion of this. And so I think we're going to have a draft bill in January. We've been working with a town manager in Barnstable and all of our town managers, as well as members of the boards of selectmen, and here you're the sole council I represent. And really, I think as we have that draft, we'll really want your feedback on this. But I think that I'm hopeful that this may, with room occupancy, sort of the train that's moving in the legislature, that this may be an opportunity for us to receive additional resources or dedicated resources that'll go to the state portion of this, because room occupancy is such a significant chunk of resources here. Expansion of room occupancy is going to mean some important things. I felt very strongly that we should not be dipping into the existing local option that our towns have. Most of the communities I represent are at 4%. Several towns are at 6%. I believe Barnstable was at 6%, but I could be mistaken on that. So to make sure that you folks get that whole, but looking at an additional surcharge, similar to how convention centers, the convention centers are funded in Boston, in Worcester, and Springfield. So in Boston, Worcester, and Springfield, convention centers are funded by a 2.75% surcharge on rooms. And so we're currently looking at what is the level of surcharge that would be needed in addition on room occupancy to basically come up with about $20 million a year for the next 30, 40 years. I've also been really pushing at making sure that we take a look at our peer communities on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. They actually face some of the same wastewater challenges that we do. They also have already have significant room occupancy revenues, but with expansion of room occupancy, we'll have a tremendous influx of that. And if you included Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket in this program, does that not expand the pot of money and then also decrease the rate, the percentage that you would need? So this is something that we've been working on in a very bipartisan fashion in the delegation. We'll have a bill, an updated bill in January. We'll want your feedback on that. I think, though, that this, in trying to figure out how we're going to come up with these resources from the state, if we can't do this, then it falls on you and your communities and your property taxpayers to pay for this, either through property taxes or through betterments. Given the high cost of living here already, we do have relatively low property taxes, but in communities, I look at a community like Provincetown, which has implemented broad sewering. Their betterments are basically a doubling of their property taxes, and so that's something that I think is just not tenable in given the stresses that so many folks have here in our communities. So much more to come on that, but I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful that we may be able to come with a pretty significant chunk of dough, using OPM, other people's money, to have that state's portion of this to reduce the cost. So more to come on that. Other efforts that, if you're interested in, I'm glad to elaborate on. In the Senate, we took up several omnibus pieces of legislation. One dealing with criminal justice reform. The House actually took this up as well, both as a bipartisan bill. There's a lot of commonalities in both of these bills, actually. There's been most of the attention is on looking at mandatory minimums, but there's a lot of really good things in here around bail reform. I think there's been a change in part because of the opioid epidemic. I think there's been a change in how people perceive and see criminal justice. In this bill, there's some actually strengthening of penalties as well for the emergence of fentanyl and carfentanil and other synthetics, where basically you cannot find heroin in eastern Massachusetts that doesn't have a synthetic fentanyl or fentanyl-like product. So that currently is in a conference committee. I think and in the House this was voted, I think, 144-9. So I think we're going to come out eager to see where that comes out, but I think that's something to expect. The other really huge challenge, and you folks know this, is our healthcare costs. Healthcare is probably the second largest line item in your budget after personnel. That's the case in many, that's our case for our families. It's the case for our private businesses, public agencies, and especially here on the Cape, where so many of us are employed either in really small businesses or self-employed. The cost of health insurance is just a really tremendous challenge. The Senate took up a series of healthcare reforms The governor has proposed reforms as well. The House is going to take up their own package in the late winter or spring. I think there's some really good things in the Senate bill that will benefit this region, specifically in expanding access of telemedicine. This is a real big challenge. If you look at mental health and behavioral health services here, and you talk to Cape Cod Healthcare or other providers, getting psychiatric care, and especially psychiatrists, has been a really big challenge for organizations. I think that's something that we'll see an expansion of telemedicine. There's an expansion in what EMTs can do under their existing scope of practice, but what they can bill for, what you, the municipality, can bill for. And so there's a whole host of pieces in there. A renewal of a prevention and wellness trust fund that's benefited the Upper Cape pretty significantly, providing public health dollars for hypertension and falls prevention. So I think you're going to see, I think you'll see the House move on something, and likely another healthcare reform effort sort of coming to the fore by the end of the session at the end of July. So those are the pieces that we've been working on. Definitely want to mention the opiate epidemic, which statewide, I think we are seeing a decrease in the rates of death by opiate overdose. That is not the case here on Cape Cod. Actually, we're seeing, and very alarmingly, we're seeing an uptick in rates of HIV transmission from IV drug users. Very concerning. I think that here we got a lot of more work to do. Governor Baker's filed a bill that we're going to be taking up. Very eager and interested to hear your feedback and the community's feedback on what else we can do. How do we throw the kitchen sink at this epidemic, given the real challenges that we have here, not only with opioid use, but addiction broadly. You know, I think many of us saw the data. I think something that we know, but when you see it in the headlines, that we have the highest rates of alcoholism in Massachusetts, and so a lot of work there. Really want to praise the community impact unit that the police department has pioneered here. I've sat down with Chief McDonald and with his lieutenants. Was thrilled to honor Sergeant Ellis and members of her team in several behavioral health awards. I think that's really beginning to make the difference, in that coordination of care, I think is making the difference here in Hyannis. I think we clearly need to do more, and however I can assist on that, please let me know. When it comes to the opioid epidemic as well, there's some very, I think, compelling data that the county has put out, and you know, I'm definitely a data-driven guy when it comes to public health stuff. So the county looked at a death related to opiate overdose from 2004 to 2014. So this is several hundred individuals, and looking at are there some commonalities that we're seeing among these individuals. And two things jumped out. One is that 69%, nearly 70% of the individuals who died of opiate overdose on Cape Cod in that period are people with a high school education or less, meaning that they are straight to work. So from an intervention perspective, it is the young people in our community who are graduating high school but not going on to higher education, or not graduating high school, that are at significantly higher risk for opiate use and opiate overdose and death. And that also that one in four of these individuals, 25%, were employed in construction and trades. And so we're going to be working with the county, hopefully going before school committees, talking about this, seeing how you can work with folks in the private sector, in our construction communities and trades. You know, but any ideas and thoughts around how we continue to chip away at this would be appreciated. For matters that are going to come come January and February, when the legislature reconvenes, we're going to be taking up a number of bills. The ones that I'm involved in, I think we're going to see a housing production and zoning reform bill. This is something my predecessor was able to get through the Senate. I think you will see something that's very different from what the Senate passed last year. But the governor's filed a bill on housing production. I think when it comes to housing and housing affordability, we have a real crisis all across the region. Compared to my neck of the woods, you folks are in better shape than we are on the Outer Cape or on the islands. But you know, towns like Truro are very much sort of the canary in the coal mine here. And I'm really looking at, and our office is looking at, how do you take often these statewide programs which have been focused on sort of traditional capital A affordable housing, which one, often aren't a fit for our community's needs, and two, just from a design perspective, most of the developments that we have here are, you know, 14 units, maybe up to 20 units. The incentives that the state has just sort of aren't a fit for the scale that we have. So I've been talking with Secretary Jay Ash and others around some ideas and some proposals that we're hoping to put either in this housing production bill or in a housing bond bill that we're going to do. I mentioned the governor's opioid bill that we'll be taking up. Of course, the budget's sort of the biggest thing the legislature does every year, and that'll be coming. Certainly, please let my office know priorities that you may have. And I think on another issue just to look towards, on education, I don't think the legislature is going to be taking up anything meaningful on education this session. There's been several bills that have been kicked around. One has been passed around English language learners. But I think there's increasingly a look towards in 2019 when it comes to education and education funding formulas, increasing the conversation on Beacon Hill and among policymakers is that there's a need to sort of widen, to sort of expand the pie, increase the pie. I think that with several items that are on the ballot, including the Fair Share Amendment, which is going to be in the ballot in 2018, this may provide over $1 billion, up to maybe $1-point-something billion in revenue that's dedicated to education and infrastructure. I think for our region, it would be prudent, and I've been asking all of the select boards and the council here to be thinking ahead to, if in 2019, if there's additional resources, and there is a conversation that's happening at the state, looking at Foundation Budget Review Commission and others, potentially even looking at Chapter 70 funding formulas. What are the aspects of this that we can prepare for? And I'd really ask you here, and ask the communities. I think if we can work towards even having 1 or 2 meetings, you know, throughout the coming year, and preparing for this, I think we'll be in better shape, just given the complexities of these policies. So I think that's something to stay tuned for, and for folks who have that, you know, knowledge and in that area, please be in touch with my office in assisting and preparing for that in 2019. So that's that's all the updates I can think of. I'm sure there's a whole host of more. Glad to take comments, questions, certainly 2 things that I've left out, because I'm sure I have. But it's a real honor to serve Barnstable and all these communities, and I just appreciate your time and your collaboration.
Thank you very much for the update. Much appreciated. We'll get time for a few questions for the senator. Any councilors have questions? Councilor Cullum.
Yes, thank you for coming tonight, Senator Cyr, and for the updates. I do have a question about the timeline of 3881, which is the bill that I spoke to on Beacon Hill. I know it's in committee now. I don't want it to die in committee.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you can give me an update on where it is and what its prognosis might be.
So it's in the Municipalities Committee, and in the legislature, if we don't have a deadline or self-imposed deadline, self-imposed deadlines are good for us, and we have one that's coming up. So February 7th is what's called Joint Rule 10-Day. The rule essentially says that bills that have been assigned to joint committees, and this bill is included in that, must render a decision by this date. The Senate fought really hard in our rule negotiations to move this date up. Traditionally, Joint Rule 10-Day was in the middle of March. It was usually around March 15th. And strategically, what would happen, right, is you just run out of time in the legislative calendar, which is a tactic, right? Also we're a deliberative body, so you can view it both as tactic and strategy, and also structural. So February 7th is when there'll be sort of an initial determination. I think I'm encouraged that the revised language that we worked on, and that Rep. Crocker's now going to try to have amended. I think that gives it a better shot. I do think that traditionally anything around the Dover Amendment, there's been reticence to take that up in the legislature, especially town by town. One of the ideas that I've been kicking around is saying, all right, if we can't get progress on this, how do we have a meaningful conversation about the Dover Amendment? Is there a study commission that the state could or should convene really to look at this, to provide a path forward on it? And we may actually have through this housing production bill that we're going to take up, that may actually be a vehicle to propose that. So I think we're going to know we'll know by February 7th. I think traditionally, as I've said, it's often a steep hill when it comes to looking for specific exemptions. But there may be other ways to get at this, or other bites at the apple, if that makes sense.
May I just have a quick follow-up? I just thank you for that update. I just wanted to mention a couple other things that I don't expect responses on, but are on my mind. You had mentioned increasing services, psychiatric services. One thing that we're incredibly lacking on Cape Cod are psychiatric services for children that are dual diagnosis or borderline addict. That's something that really needs some focus. The county also came out with some really troubling statistics about 4 or 5 years ago that said less than 1 cent on every dollar is spent on prevention in our communities. And so I would argue that if we don't get serious about prevention in our communities, we're not going to see the end of this epidemic at all. So that would be my voice on that. The other thing I hear a lot about is, so maybe it's just me talking. I'm just listening to myself. I would really like to, and that happens a lot actually in my house.
Happens to be too.
I'm the only one who listens to me anyway, so what the hell. But I would really like to see the Cape delegation take on homelessness as from a unified front. Look at it in a regional way, the way we look at our wastewater, the way we look at our groundwater. I feel that, and you know this from our conversations, that we shoulder the burden of this responsibility in Hyannis. I feel it's very unfair. And I think if all of us get on board with a regional approach to this, we might actually get somewhere. And lastly, I'd just like to mention one of the concerns that I've heard from some constituents are around regulations or the lack thereof regarding Uber. And I wondered if maybe there was an appetite at some point on Beacon Hill to, I know there's some things being kicked around, but I don't know really what the gist of it is. You don't need to update me now. We can do it in an email later, but I just wanted to mention that that's a concern of some constituents. Thank you.
So on Uber and Lyft and ride sharing, in the last session prior to when I joined the legislature, they actually passed a piece of legislation. We'll get you that information. I'm right there with you on dual diagnosis. Really, prevention dollars are just so you get so much bang for your buck, and I am in learning the frustration of really going and making this argument to my colleagues, as someone who really believes in prevention and public health, and we're still not there yet. I think your comments on really looking at a regional approach to homelessness and housing, instability is a smart way for us to look at this. One of the pieces I'm interested in is asking, in trying to take a look at how the state does procurements. And when I think the state does procurements for services, there has been, in recent years, maybe in recent decades, even in my understanding of how the RFP, the request for proposals, are written, is that it essentially says, "Oh, we want you to be located in Barnstable and Hyannis." I think that is that's actually been a shift. I think my understanding is historically there were more services that were across the region. And even as someone with an Outer Cape perspective, would certainly be thrilled to see more services, in Orleans or in Harwich. The drive down here, especially in summer months, is, I think there's an appetite for that. And so that's one of the things I think I'm going to ask my office and ask the administration just to take a look in certain areas, I think, because there's often I've run into this problem Another way that we run into this problem, for instance, is a lot of the RFPs will say, well, Cape and Islands. And meaningfully, there's very little work that's actually being done on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And so if you talk to the islanders, they sort of bristle at the, sort of like that, on the other end, we're being sort of left out by this. And so maybe that's an opportunity. And I think we should think about would love to work with you and anyone on this, about how do we look at both the existing programs that are there and then programs that will be coming along the line. I do think that housing development is critically important here all across Cape Cod. The Cape Cod Commission came out with this fabulous housing study that goes, town by town, how many units we need. In Truro, we need 64 units. We can build 64 units in Truro. In Barnstable, I think it's somewhere near 600 or 700 units. As the town manager was saying, wastewater is really part of that path to building those units. But I think part of it is I think we've seen a real compression with rising an out-of-whack real estate market, the increased cost of housing, and I think you're seeing just increased pressure on everyone, but especially those most vulnerable folks. And that's going to continue unless we fix that. And so part of this needs to be part of this needs to be a housing production approach, and I think part of it needs to really be looking at services region-wide. So look forward to continue to working with you on that. I appreciate those comments.
Councilor Rapcorsetti.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Cyr, for attending. I have a constituent or two that reads the agenda, so they knew you were coming. And they asked me to respectfully request, because we pay, I think, about $600,000 a mile in road maintenance on town roads, on state roads, I'd like to see some money put to maintaining the roads and removing the trash from them. The town, especially town of Barnstable's Route 28 is deplorable, the trash along that side of the road, and 149. And I'd like to see a little more effort on the state's behalf to keep the roadways clean. So that's my request for you tonight. Okay?
Glad to pass that along. Thank you.
Councilor Schnapp.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator Cyr, for coming tonight. And again, another thank you for helping with our Cape delegation getting the housing court expansion approved this year. One of the things that will make that housing court expansion even more valuable to our community is if we can get funding for expansion of the tenancy preservation program. To keep people from becoming homeless, we need to keep people in housing, and that's a known resource to help people with disabilities stay in their housing. So hopefully that is on the agenda.
Was thrilled that we were able to get the housing court expansion through. I think that this is emblematic about how it's really important that when we're talking about state policy and who's in the legislature, I think there's a lot of coordination that those of us who, and collaboration that those of us who represent sort of the hinterlands have taken. And I think that actually really speaks to an ability to get resources, beyond that greater Boston area, which is a challenge in a numbers perspective. I think in the Senate we have the sort of hinterland caucus has a bit of an advantage, and we're trying to maintain that. It's critically important, and the tenancy preservation program will look into how we can support that. There was some talk too of, and you're probably really the expert here on this. I know that in Plymouth there's actually a mental health court that Plymouth County has had, and I think that it's something that curious about how we could maybe potentially look to have that here. We have a successful drug court. We're now going to have a housing court, but really, I think you see a real. And if you talk to the folks who are working with the people who are, if you talk to Sergeant Ellis, right, these folks are dealing with drug issues, mental health issues, and housing. And so the more we can coordinate that, I think we'll get better outcomes, and I think it works towards some of the things that Councilor Cullen was talking about as well.
I think we just have one more question. Vice President Crocker.
Thank you. I must admit, though, it's really not one question. He's been very forthcoming, if I may, Mr. President, so I'm just trying to touch all of them. Thank you for coming tonight, Senator. Thank you for lending me an ear a couple months ago when we were talking about these issues. And as you saw tonight, there's still issues that are paramount to our town. We didn't put those on the agenda because you were showing up. We're putting those on the agenda because we need to cut a deal with fish and wildlife for water for hyenas. We need to solve that problem. You know, we need to talk about sewering, the 208 plan, and how we expand and how we prepare for expanding. The state, when it lays out 208, it doesn't take onus for its own roads. We can't do the work on it, yet they're making us develop a plan with our soft cost of how it may be handled, the runoff, when they're not even doing their part to prepare their own plan on the runoff. And we have people who come to our meeting from time to time telling us there's open drains right on their Route 6A and other places. So we need your help to clarify that as well. We need your help to talk about your own proposal for the Cape Cod water protection. The idea is sound. The trouble with Barnstable is we don't always feel we get back what we put in.
Yep.
It's almost like dealing with the state. We know that the Assembly of Delegates gives us a weighted vote, but we don't get back the proportion of the money that we put in as Barnstable residents. We're here to support everybody. We're very fortunate we can have a planning board when your hometown can't, but therefore, because we have a planning board, we rely on them more heavily than the Cape Cod Commission. So any of your considerations for the Cape Cod water protection have to talk about returning the money where the money came from.
Yep.
So as long as that stays as a big figure point, I think the idea will be solid. We have the estuary tariff split going out of Lewis Bay for Yarmouth and Barnstable. And so now we're splitting the tariff for the Steamship Authority. And that has opened the door with our manager to have some solid talks about how we're going to handle the estuary, how we're going to address that. But these returns from the biggest town have to be a product of serving the solutions for the biggest towns. And we're one of those. I also would like to say that we have the Assistant DPW Director with us tonight, and he's going to talk about, you know, part of that municipal plan with Yarmouth and how we are continuing on with the Sandwich and Mashpee one. All of these issues and everything that we're talking about right now is get us in a shovel-ready position so that our good senator can find us some money. And when we have plans and we're shovel-ready, we'll be somebody who solves some of its problems. You know, Chatham got rewards for being shovel-ready. Let's be honest, they got a good subsidy. Providence Town has done very well getting its estuary under control. Now we see Howard teaming up in a joint effort to do some of its sewering issues. Barnstable, by its size, is going to have to handle Barnstable's issues first and take care of its estuaries before we can talk about a cooperative effort to put some of our sewing into Yarmouth. So we want to be a good neighbor with Yarmouth, but we only have limited capacity, we only have limited dollars, so we have to say, well, where's our priorities going to land on something like this? On the idea, one idea that I have to tell you and I don't have the exact same match on is the act relative to room rental.
Okay.
Room rental is a great income for some towns that have peaked and have not had other ways with new growth dollars, have not opened their zoning to continue their opportunity for taxation. We need new growth dollars to make our place run. We know that. Mark Milne is here with us tonight. He's excellent at telling us we need to accomplish certain goals to keep everything copacetic, or we're going to go to the chopping block. And everybody up here is committed to chop if that's what it takes. But with new growth dollars, we can get there. I have never seen anybody who's been discussing that issue talk about the relative adjustments between a single home and a small motel that we have all over the Cape, no matter which town it's in. So I took it upon myself, and I'm in the real estate profession, to take a look at a house in Austell for $800,000 assessment, and to take a look at the Craigville Beach Inn, 32 rooms, and $834 assessment. So at its face, they both pay the same taxes to the town of Barnstable. So the tax revenue is similar. The difference is the tax revenue that's established by a motel is based on its occupancy or vacancy. So they may have a fluctuating adjustment where the residents will continue to rise because they have to carry the lion's share of the taxation. Secondly, we can never, ever, ever honestly say, any of us here, that 32 rooms discharging septic, driving on our roads, going to the utilities that we have, is the same impact on municipal services, calling for fire, calling for police, as a single homeowner. A single homeowner who you're talking about taxing, he leaves his property and he puts someone else in there for the same impact that he would have had. So we're not looking at the same impact on municipal services, yet we're trying to put a taxation out there, and you're comfortably trying to call it an expansion of state funds when it's a tax. And there's a breadcrumb on top. Some of the tax will come back to us, but the majority of the tax is going to leave Barnstable, just like it does for education, just like it does. And you're a terrific senator, and there's some great reps, but we never get a fair share in the formulas. So it's going to be hard for me to support any type of room tax when you look around. Our major employer is the hospital. The number 2 employer is the town.
Yep.
Hospitality is our business. It's not just a dream. You start to make an impact on it by taxing them here, and they're not being taxed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They're not being taxed in Newport. Something's going to give here, and it's going to give at our expense. And the large portion of the fee is going to go to Boston, and we got the breadcrumbs again. So we really should take a hard look. If you're really ready someday, I'll sit with you and show you a comparison. Because when you really think about taxing a single homeowner and taxing a small cottage industry like a motel, hotel, whatever, the impacts on the municipal services aren't even close. Aren't even close. And so when they pay the tax, they're trying to close the gap for us on the demands of those personal services. And so that's what I have a great distinction between us. And one last thing on that particular issue is, if we're going after if we're going after,
We already did that.
if we're going after Airbnb because they're operating a business in our town, I don't think any of us will fight that. We get that. But if you're going after the small homeowner who always is paying their residential taxes, who then has to pay income tax on the revenue they take in as rent, and we're at risk of driving legacy people away from the Cape because it's cheaper to go to Block Island, it's cheaper to go to the shore in Rhode Island, it's cheaper to go to Plymouth. You're putting a lot at risk for a very small breadcrumb.
Yep.
You know. So those are the things I'd like you to think about. And lastly, on Senator Wolf's former revise of our zoning rules, the thing that really was a downfall of it, which nobody seemed to grasp either,
Yep.
was the way it really looked at grandfathering and completely eliminated it. When you eliminate grandfathering, you turn assessing upside down.
Yeah.
Assessing can have different classifications based on the use of the real estate, and without knowing that that use can be continued, I'm not sure that the tax world doesn't turn upside down. Ownership changes, and the cost and the value of the real estate changes. If all that changes, the tax goes back to the residential person again. So the eliminating a grandfather was the biggest wrong in what he brought forward before. So I hope you keep that in mind as you go forward as well.
Thank you. We'll absolutely take you up on your offer to sit down and go through some of these pieces in more detail. When it comes to expansion of the room, basically applying room occupancy tax to short-term rentals, I really view this as this is sort of the vehicle, the train that's moving. There's a number of proposals that I didn't go into, but there's been several bills that have been filed on this. So the primary House bill, I should say, what the Senate has done is just sort of it applies. You know, Airbnb, motel room, renting a house, all the same thing. Representative Aaron Michaelwitz, who's from the North End, has filed a bill that establishes a whole host of tiers and actually exemptions for primary homeowners. So there's a lot of different ways that we're looking at that. I think I'm most interested in saying, all right, if this is the vehicle that's moving, and we've got this really big wastewater infrastructure problem that we need help from the state, is this not, how do we figure out getting some resources for that? I think what's interesting in looking at the wastewater protection trust, the Clean Water Trust, is that there are a number of communities. So Truro, for instance, Truro is going to have may have some sewering needs if you know the area of Beach Point going into Provincetown. But broadly, Truro doesn't have the wastewater problem that Provincetown or Barnstable or Yarmouth has, right? Truro, especially under if room occupancy applies to short-term rentals, Truro is going to come up with a whole boatload of money that would then go to address, the regional problem. And so some of those monies would flow here to Barnstable. Some of those monies would flow to Orleans. I was before the Truro Board of Selectmen earlier, this week, and I was a little nervous, because sometimes there's, you hear the big town refrain, you hear the small town refrain. I was actually heartened to hear from the Truro Board of Selectmen that they're like, we want to be investing in infrastructure in Orleans and in Hyannis because our community can't exist if, we don't have the Stop and Shop in Orleans and the hospital in Hyannis. So would love to sit down and walk through some of the numbers. I think that unlike other formulas, Barnstable may get a much fairer shake than in other areas. And we'll look into the town work with MassDOT. So thank you for all those comments. I really appreciate the time to President's, Mr. President, and to members of the council. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me in my office on any issues that are coming forward. And same thing working with Tim and Will and Randy. Really delighted to move forward on these issues and anything else we can do.
The follow-up I would like, other than keeping an eye on fish and wildlife, because we've got to solve Hyannis water.
Yep.
The last thing is the home rule that was first mentioned by you.
Yep.
And that's our ability to expand why we are setting aside the taxes. Right now, the taxes are set aside just for the construction of sewer. And if you understand, that just doesn't get a shovel ready. So we're looking to make sure it's for planning, for permits, and other than just big pipe all the time, we may be doing some dredging in estuaries to have the same result. So we can't tell you how important that is. We have put aside every dime, and I know some of your other towns use it for general funds and everything. We put aside every dime of that, and we're ready to really tackle our estuary. So we'd love to get that squared away.
I'm optimistic about that bill, and I wish every town I represented was truly Barnstable's been pretty proactive on this issue, and I think that I really worry that without some sort of state infusion of capital, other communities are not going to be able to do this. I actually think you folks are in better shape, than others. But
Well, get us that rewrite, will you?
yeah, no, I was really trying to get it done by tonight, but I think it's going to happen early in the new year.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for the time. Really appreciate you coming in and updating us on many things going on. There's always plenty to work on.
Yeah.
And we have some really big issues coming, especially in the next year. So we'll look forward to working with you on that.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Thank you.
I have a couple of announcements.